Today I wanted to show you how I feed my sourdough starter and then take you along throughout the next few days as we go from feeding the starter all the way through to baking some bread. I typically feed my starter once a week, and the time I generally have to bake bread is on the weekends. So today is Friday, it's Friday afternoon, I just got home from work. I'm gonna feed my starter tonight so that it can get nice and bubbly and it will be ready to use tomorrow. This is what my starter looks like straight out of the fridge. It basically always looks like this every time I take it out. And as you can see, there is a layer of liquid on top, which I will show you from a different view so you can really see it a bit better. So this liquid on top is called hooch. Sometimes it's a little bit more clear and sometimes it's grayish in color like it is today. Sometimes there's a little bit, sometimes there's a lot, but basically every time I take my starter out of the fridge after it's been in there for a bit, it has this layer. So like I said, it's called hooch and it's completely normal. This is just a byproduct of your starter. It doesn't mean that your starter is dead. It doesn't mean that it's gone bad. It's totally normal and you can either pour it off or mix it in, but I usually pour it off, so I'm gonna do that now. Okay, here's what I'm left with after I just poured that off. So you can see that there's still some bubbles when I move the starter around, even though from the side it looks like it's completely inactive. It's still got something going on in there. Before I feed my starter, I want to use some of this discard to make some sourdough discard pizzas. So I will take some out for my pizzas and then I'll show you how I feed what's left. I have kind of a good amount in here and I don't want that much to be left when I feed it. And also I want to make sure I have enough for the pizza crust. So I'm just taking out kind of most of it. And since I'm not ready to bake the pizzas yet, I am just gonna put this discard in this container and I'll keep the container in the fridge until I'm ready to use it. A quick word about discard. You do not have to discard your starter every time you feed it, but if you don't ever take some away and you just continually feed it without baking a lot of bread, you will eventually end up with a ton of starter, just because of the nature of how the sourdough starter works. So I usually on my feeding days like to take some discard and use it for something. So today I'm using it for pizza crust. Sometimes I use it for pancakes. Sometimes I use it for cookies. There are so many recipes out there that you can make with the sourdough discard. So I'm just gonna keep it here until I'm ready for the pizzas. And in the meantime, I'm going to feed the starter. Here's what's left after discarding. And honestly, I could have taken more than this if I wanted to. I would say I have maybe a quarter cup in here if I had to guess. You really only need a tiny bit of starter left whenever you're gonna feed it, and whatever you feed, the tiny amount will multiply and grow and it will become an active starter again. This is what I'm leaving today, so I'm just gonna grab some unbleached all-purpose flour and some filtered water and we will feed this. There are many ways you can feed your sourdough starter, and some people get very precise with it and they measure out exactly how many grams of flour and water that they're feeding each time. When I first made my starter, I knew that if I was gonna have to get the scale out and measure my flour and water, as silly as it sounds, because it is simple, but I knew that if I had to do that, I was not gonna keep up with it. So instead, I don't measure. I know that's controversial, but I've learned what I like my sourdough starter to look and feel like. And so I feed it at least this amount, whatever's left in here, I feed it at least this amount of flour and water. You can do more. And I just keep adding flour, water, until it's the consistency that I like and I have the amount of starter that I want to have. So I will start with the flour. I'm just using this as a scoop. And I want to bake kind of a lot of things with this, so I'm going to feed it kind of a good amount. Okay, so we'll start with that and then I'll add my water. I know that some people are probably cringing right now that I'm not measuring, but this is just how I do it. It works for me. It's been working for me. I get beautiful loaves of bread. Okay, already I can tell this is way too thick, so I'm gonna add some more water. Still too thick. I did add a lot of flour, and I did not add that much water. Okay, now it's too thin. Don't worry about the lumps. Those are gonna go away. You guessed it, I'm gonna add some more flour. Some people might think that this is silly that I just keep adding, and they might be thinking, why don't you just measure? I don't mind this process, and it actually intimidates me less because I feel like I can't mess it up. If it's too thick, I add more water. If it's too thin, I add more flour, and I just keep going from there. We are definitely getting there. I like my starter to be a little bit thicker than this. I feel like this is kind of a true pancake batter consistency, and I like mine to be a little bit thicker than this. So I'm gonna add just a little more flour. Okay, let's see. Okay, to me, this is perfect. It runs off in clumps. It's not just completely falling off the spoon. So I'm gonna leave this just like this. Let's scrape down the sides and see how much we have. All right, so here's what we've got. I'm happy with this amount of starter. I'm happy with the consistency. And so now I'm gonna just put a piece of tape right at the top of where the starter is. Some people use a rubber band instead of tape, but my container's kind of big and I don't have a big enough rubber band. So this will just serve as a marker so I can see as it rises how much it's risen. I'm gonna put the top on. And now is the scariest part where we wait and see if this rises. The thing is, I know it's going to because it always does, but I still get nervous every time, and it's such a relief when I finally start to see some bubbles. So I'm gonna leave this on the counter and I will come back once it has risen. It's the next morning, and last night before I went to bed, I put my starter in the fridge. It rose by about half, and so when it was at that point, I put it in the fridge overnight because if I left it on the counter, I could have still used it today, but it would have fallen by a lot more than this. So you can see it's still got lots of bubbles in it. It's still nice and active, so I can use this to bake with today. I'm getting the dough started by putting 650 grams of warm water in a large bowl, followed by 200 grams of my active starter. And as you can see, it's floating on top of the water, which is a good indication that the starter is nice and active. Next, I'm putting 500 grams of all-purpose flour, 200 grams of whole wheat flour, and 250 grams of bread flour, and then finally 20 grams of salt. Now I start mixing mine with my silicone spatula, or you could use a wooden spoon, just to get everything incorporated and make sure there are no dry spots. And then I switch over to my hands. So I'll keep one hand dry and use it to rotate the bowl. And the other hand I will wet so that the dough doesn't stick to it as much. Grab some dough from outside and push it in towards the middle, and just keep doing this until the dough seems well mixed. Then I cover it with a damp towel and let it rest for 30 minutes before I start my first set of stretch and folds. So this is the fun part. You grab some dough from the outside, stretch it up as far as you can without breaking, and then fold it over to the opposite side. Turn the bowl 90 degrees and do the same thing. So stretch it up, fold it down, turn the bowl, stretch it up, fold it down, turn the bowl, and you'll do this a total of 4 times. Cover it again, and then you're going to repeat this stretch and fold process a total of 6 times. So as you saw, I always wet my hands before I do my stretch and fold so that the dough doesn't stick to it. I do my first 3 stretch and folds 15 minutes apart, and then my final 3 stretch and folds 30 minutes apart. It's time for the final stretch and fold. I'm sorry if you can hear the tile saw in the background. So the dough feels much more firm. It's a lot tighter and it doesn't stretch as much, which means the gluten is definitely forming. I kind of just like to sort of curl the dough over itself like this, so it makes a sort of round ball. And then I'll cover it, and now it's time to do its bulk rise. So that just means it's going to rise until it's just about doubled and it's full of air bubbles. This takes anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 hours, depending on how cold your house is. So I'll just keep it here and I'll check on it every now and then over the next few hours. Once it's full of air bubbles and has risen a lot, I'll come back so that we can split it and shape it. It's been about 7 hours, I want to say, and you can see that the dough has risen. There's lots of air bubbles inside. So now is the time when I shape it before putting it in the fridge overnight. So I'm getting it out of the bowl and using my bench scraper to split the dough in half. You can measure this to make sure that both halves are exactly the same weight, but I never do that. So what I do is I grab the dough from the middle with both hands and I fold it over itself to kind of create a loose ball shape. And then I pull the dough down on the counter. You want to make the top of the dough nice and smooth and tight. So I just keep rotating my hands, pulling the dough down until I have a smooth ball. So here I am just flouring my Banneton baskets. You also could use a bowl with a towel inside if you don't have Banneton baskets. And I let the dough rest for 15 minutes and then I do the actual shaping. So for the round loaf, I pull the top down into the middle and then the bottom up into the middle. And then I bring either side into the middle before I roll the dough up onto itself. And then sort of the same thing as before, I use the friction of the counter and pull down to make a nice tight ball. And then you want to put it into your basket, seam side up. It's okay if there is a big seam down the middle because what I'm doing right now is called stitching the dough. So I take little pieces of dough from either side of the seam and cross them over themselves to make the dough nice and tight in the middle. And now I'm shaping the oval loaf, so I start the same way, bring the top and the bottom into the middle, and then I'm going on one side and literally rolling the dough up before pulling it towards myself. I tuck in the sides and give it another pull. And then same thing, I'm going to put this into my Banneton basket, seam side up, and stitch the dough up. Sometimes if you go to stitch the dough right away, it will just spring right back open again. If that happens, just let the dough rest for 10-15 minutes and try to stitch it again, and I promise it will be so much easier and the dough will actually stick where you place it. Once the dough is nice and tight, I'm just putting it into plastic bags. These are just plastic bread bags that I got off Amazon, and I just keep reusing the same two. And I put it in the bags like this. I just kind of fold over the bottom, and I put these into the fridge, and they'll stay in the fridge overnight. So it is now not the next day, but the following day after I initially shaped those loaves. So I shaped them on Saturday night. Yes, I shaped them on Saturday night. Now it's Monday. I just got home from work. I am going to bake them now. Yesterday, my kitchen was just very busy. My dad and my husband have been working on the backsplash, which is extremely exciting. And yesterday, they just finally finished the tile. So if you have seen in the beginning of this video, a messy kitchen and a lot going on, that's why. This is one of the nice things about sourdough, in my opinion, is you really can make it work for your schedule. So a lot of people just assume that it's very time consuming, and the whole process does take a long time, or it can take a long time. Like now I'm on my, Friday night is when I fed it. Saturday I made the dough and shaped the loaves, and now Sunday kind of was nothing. Monday I'm doing it. So this is going on the 4th day that I have this bread to work with. But if you think about the active time, it took me a minute to feed my sourdough starter. It did take me some time on Saturday to mix up the dough and then do my stretch and folds. That's the most active process. But that was like a little bit of work over the course of a few hours. And then it's just kind of been sitting. It's been sitting out on the counter until it doubled. Took a few minutes to shape it, and now it's been sitting in the fridge for over a day. Anyway, I'm gonna bake my bread now. The first step for me when it comes to actually baking the bread is preheating my Dutch oven. So I'm gonna preheat it just like this. It's empty, I keep the lid on, and I'll put it in the oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit. The Dutch oven is preheated, so now it's time to score my bread. So I just took it out of the fridge, and I'm gonna invert it onto this silicone bread sling. This thing is life-changing. Before I had this, I used just parchment paper, and that definitely works. It's totally fine. But this has been so nice because it has these handles that you can use to lower and lift the bread out of the Dutch oven. It's seriously a game changer. I got mine on Amazon. So I'm going to take it out of there and then sprinkle some flour. This helps the pattern stand out, the scoring pattern. And I've found that it's much easier to score dough that's cold. So I like sticking mine in the fridge. Even if I'm doing like a quicker sourdough, I like to stick it in the fridge for a bit just to cool it so that it's a little more firm. Okay, so for today, what should we do? I think I'm gonna do I am not an expert sourdough scorer, but I do enjoy it. Something else that I've learned is it's easier to do these shallower decorative scores before you do the expansion scores. If you do the expansion scores, it kind of relaxes the dough and separates it a little bit, and then it makes it harder for these to stand out. So I'm doing these first, and then a deeper slash down the middle. I could leave it like that, but I think I'm gonna go for the cross today. And doing this provides the steam somewhere to escape in a kind of more controlled way. If you don't score your dough, the steam will find a way to escape, but it might not look as pretty. Okay, so now that it's scored, I'm gonna transfer it into the hot Dutch oven. Put it in there. I leave the tab sticking out, and then put the lid on. And I'm gonna stick this in the oven at 475 for 27 minutes. That's what I've found to work best for me. It's been 27 minutes. It's time to take the lid off. Oh yeah, that's looking good. Okay, so now I'm gonna lower the temperature to 450 and bake this for another 10 minutes. Now for the oval loaf. Turn it this way to make it easier for scoring. And last time I made an oval loaf, I did this really cool design. I'm gonna attempt to do it again, but I don't actually know if it's gonna work. And I know I just said not to make the expansion score before you do the other decorative cuts, but I feel like I have to do the expansion score first. We're just gonna go for it. Into the Dutch oven she goes. So remember how I said earlier when I was doing the round loaf that the flour on top makes it stand out, makes the pattern stand out more? Well, apparently I forgot to do the flour on this one, but it was a great experiment for me, a good learning experience, because now I know what happens if you don't spread flour over the top before scoring. And what happens is it still bakes beautifully. Yes, my pattern could have stood out a bit more and maybe it would look even more you know, like one of those picture perfect sourdough loaves, but it still looks good and it's still gonna taste just the same. So the last step that I do after the loaf has fully cooled, you do not want to cut into it when it's still warm. You don't want to put it away when it's still warm. So once it's fully cooled, I will put it in a bag to store it. So you can use just a Ziploc bag. You can use a plastic bread bag. My husband got me these reusable bread bags for Christmas, which I love. And they're freezer safe and they really do a good job of keeping the bread, you know, fresh. And then I zip it up and I roll the top so that it gets any air out. And then do this little clasp. And I have my little bread purse. This is where I keep the bread until I'm ready to eat it. And since I made 2 loaves, I'll have one throughout this week and the other I'll put in the freezer just like this. Lots of people slice their bread before they put it in the freezer. And honestly, I don't really know why I don't do it. It's a great idea and it makes it thaw so much quicker. But I'm not in the habit of doing it. So anyway, I'm gonna freeze this one. I didn't slice it yet, but it will be fine. I'll just set it out the day before to thaw out and then it'll be ready to use the next day. The other one I'll keep in the other bag that I have on the counter and I'll just cut from it throughout the week. And that's my whole sourdough process. So I hope that you found this helpful. I hope that you found it to be not so intimidating because that was one of the barriers of entry for me. I just thought it was this really intimidating thing. So I hope that I helped you feel a little bit less nervous about starting. I definitely plan to make lots more sourdough videos in the future, along with other just general cooking and homey type videos. So if you liked it, please let me know and I'll see you in my next video.